Well, for the second time today, I'll attempt to get this video done for the quiz that you have to finish by that Friday. So look at your assignments and pace yourself. As I said today in the class about 1986 that I'll refer to a bit later, um, that in the history of comics, the person who generally gets credit for publishing the first graphic novel is Will Eisner. And that was for a Contract with God, and I believe around 76. It was a terrible seller. But anyway, he called it a novel to give it a certain legitimacy because he wanted to push comics beyond what with the usual association of sort of lowbrow literature. It's come a long way since 1976 to be sure. Now Eisner, before he became famous for his graphic novels, um, uh, he had a long run before Contract with God or The Dreamer that we read. He published for many years a weekly series, a newspaper insert called The Spirit. And this was important too because when at the end of The Dreamer, Will breaks up with the Inger, his partner, and their like comic book factory that they had, and goes off, and he's going to do Spirit. And one of the reasons is that he given full disposition, he could do with it the comic. He had full rights to the material. He can write about what he wanted. It was an unprecedented deal, and he owned everything, which is not the case with most uh, at the time. Much different today, but so Spirit was important, and he kept that up sort of after World War II until he went into commercial work with comics, and then eventually turned to the graphic novel. Now, one of the important things about um, the underground movement, they we have people today. Let's see, Bart Spiegelman, um, still alive. Harvey P. Carr passed away in 2010, and Robert Crumb, who's still alive, living in exile, in self-exile in France. And one of the things all three of them have in common, not that just they had a huge impact on comics, but they all three played an instrumental roles in the so-called underground comics or the comics, COMIX, movement. All of them did. And, bear in mind, and I mostly have decided, we talked about this in class, and with respect to what we call graphic novels or sequential art, and the power of comics makes this clear that comic books and comic strips are differ in significant ways. And there's a in the book there's even a chart. One does this, one does that. So comic strips are not comic books, to be sure. And for a variety of reasons, including braided narratives and a number of things. As I said, 1986 is sort of like the foundation year. It's not the first graphic novels were not written, but three of them left a mark. Batman, The Dark Knight, Watchmen, and Mouse. All three coming around the same time, and all three writers, slash illustrators, remain very much engaged in the world of comics today. Comics in the United States, at any rate, really, we can start talking about the influence, the whole idea of the American comics begins with Superman, Route 39, 1939. And Superman comics were written by two young men who, like Harvey P. Carr, were from Cleveland. And those names are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Um, and of course, Superman has made billions of dollars, but both Siegel and Schuster didn't really get that much. I mean, they were hired from Marvel at good good salaries for many years, but they basically sold their rights for like $260 or something. Not unusual. When someone published your work, they had the rights to it, and including, I mean, Eisner knew this because he and Inger did the same thing. It was a common practice, and eventually, the relatives at least did get some money after, and your text talks about that in um, after many years, as you'll read again. Uh, they finally did get, they got a bit of a pretty good package of money from Marvell, but mostly it went to the relatives because both of them had passed. Um, it was to see that superhero comics remained, pretty popular throughout the Second World War, but these guys come back and they're older. The younger people are looking for something different too. And after 48, the real comic book boom concerned crime comics, and these were with uh, the biggest publisher for these horror comics was EC Comics. It started out with Bill Gaines' father as Educational Comics and Entertainment Comics, because sort of it comes later. And there were millions and millions and millions of these, and I can't remember how many at one time in the stable um, that Bill Gaines' corporation published. But I mean, they dominated the field. And in his book, The Seduction of the Innocent, Wortham argued that comic books were bad for children and contributed to teen crime, that is to say, juvenile delinquency. I mean, we saw in class there were Senate hearings, and that's where Bill Gaines went in and kind of made a fool of himself because, in fact, they did push the envelope pretty much all the time in those horror comics. Um, but pretty much nothing that Frederick Wertham had to say was true. And it did lead to the burning of comic books. It led to the comic book code, and it also led to the demise of EC Comics. Now, there was one comic there that Bill Gaines and others, including, I'm trying to remember his name right there. I was thinking I have his book in here. Harvey Korman. Harvey Korman. No, that's not his name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Mad was a comic book in the EC arsenal, and what they did is they turned it into a magazine, which magazines did not come under the comic book code, the repressive comic book code. And so they were able to do a lot of things. Now, a lot of the anti establishment, anti authoritarian movement features of many of the underground comics. I mean, that's what they were. They pushed the limits on sexuality, they hammered against politics, all these things, and a lot of them were pretty pornographic. Well, Mad wasn't pornographic, but it did a lot of the things that ended up being at the core of these underground comic books. Well, anyway, and in the '60s, then we have the demise really of the comic book code. And that's when Marvel Comics, with in the early '60s, and it'll go on with Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and all those peoples. They created characters such as Peter Parker, as we discussed in class, Spider-Man. And what made a character such as Parker different was that unlike maybe Superman, he's a somewhat flawed character who battles many common problems despite his superpowers. The book talks about his uncle and also shows that wonderful scene in the comic book where Parker rescues his girlfriend, Spider-Man, and in the process breaks her neck. So there's all kinds of things like that. But that happened, and that stays with us. As a matter of fact, that's the basis of Watchmen, um, where you have all the characters who are there are the superheroes, but there are no real superheroes because there's just these regular people, except for one of the characters. But the idea is that all of them are flawed, and so Watchmen kind of deconstructs the crime, the caped crusader type characters. But that's one of the things that Marvel was able to do, is you create these flawed characters so that the readers, especially teenagers, are able to identify with them. Now, back in the beginning of the um, the early stages, I'm reminded of that scene in The Dreamer where Will is approached and said, "Can you, write these comics and we'll give you all this money?" He's just like, "Wow, yeah, that would be great." Until he finds out what the content is. The content are these Tijuana Bibles. Now he prude, perhaps a little prudish, just horrified that anybody would take money for that stuff. But a lot of people did, and that these Tijuana Bibles depicted, and they're wallet-sized, about 8 pages or more, politicians and others in a variety of a lot of illegal sex acts. Like, you take a character like Olive Oil um, from Popeye and then do something crazy with it. Well, that of course would not have been able to be published in the under the comic book code that comes um, after Bill Gaines loses his place in the Senate hearings, and then we have all the other results, including burning of books. But as I did mention, remember that the Bill got recouped, boy, all of his money by the very successful magazine. It was published as a magazine. It cost a hell of a lot more than a comic book, and it didn't require the approval of the Comics Code Authority. And that, of course, as we said, was Mad Magazine, still being published today. And again, because of that, the content of Mad did have an effect upon the rising of the underground comics. There, and who also, these comic books do not include the comic book code. They're not distributed by regular people. Remember, distribution like the Diamond or anything like that. It's like, as we said, that you have Crump selling his comic books out of a baby carriage. But they do take from Mad a kind of an anti-authoritarian theme. Now, as we said before, as I said before, I have a mouse in my pocket. Before Art Spiegelman became famous for Mouse, um, he and his wife did publish an alternative comic called Raw, which I brought into High Culture for Low Brows, and you have the Chris Ware story from that magazine. Now, he published that, and included in the publication was really the beginnings of Mouse. Mouse has a long, long beginning. Out of that, out of Raw grows the first edition of volume of Mouse, which became an instant bestseller. And so Art and his wife stop Raw, and he has enough money to devote his time to second, the second edition. So over a 10-year period, as with Black Hole, to get these things into final form. Now, we talked in class about um, actually taking the characters, the more realistic drawing of a character, the less likely the reader viewer is to identify with the character, as opposed to being taught something, as in real world stories. People look very, very realistic. Well, there's a reason for that. It's trying to teach you about an historic kind of thing, as opposed to engage you in a fictional story. And so you cartoon the characters. And in class, we talked about clear line style, is illustrated by Herré's comic Tintin. And I mentioned this, we'll see this in a big way in Palestine. We have iconic or cartoon characters appear against a realistically depicted background. So you'll see in Palestine, Joe Sacco has taken photographs of everything, and clearly in Fun Home, she cartoons herself. Alison Bechtel cartoons herself, but on the other hand, she often makes that background realistic, and she portrays herself realistically when she has a photograph of her father and her, or something along those lines. So, but in the main, these characters are cartooned to engage us in the story, whether we're going to be with a dog going into outer space or our protagonists going through places in North Korea, where you'll find some fine line drawing as well. to get the background there and to move us into it. And finally, another item we've talked about together in class a number of times is the important relationship between images and words, where they have a reciprocal relation that leads to a symbiotic relationship, or with the one where the two parts go in and you have a synergy, a greater power that comes from it. And so in graphic novels, we'll find, and McLeod and Will Eisner, we can find to a different various degrees that the images and the words are often of equal importance. Whereas I said in class, a child's picture books, the images dominate over the words. Um, we don't even need words a lot of the times. And I'll bring you in a graphic novel called Robot, and you can make up your mind whether it's a comic book or a picture book. Anyway, do a good job um, on the video, which I hope will work now. So thank you, and see you.